Today's International Women's Day. Why do you think it's important to commemorate women?
I'm prejudiced, I'm a woman. I believe it's important for our voices to be heard and to mark it in some way. And what a way to acknowledge. We have lots of international days for lots of different events and opportunity. Historically, we haven't really had that much opportunities until women had their right to vote, and some of the women's rights have just slowly in the last 50 to 100 years and so on been developing. So I think also there's diversity in how women do womanhood. It'd be nice to also culturally celebrate how we as a women look at our femininity.
Tell us more about faith-based therapy. This is something that you're particularly a specialist in. What does it mean, and what do you do with faith-based therapy?
So I'm interested in how spirituality gets talked about, and how do we bring in spiritual people's beliefs and ethical values from that into the treatment room? How do we understand how that organizes people, cognition, ideas, beliefs, behaviors, that governs people's lives? Just as, in the widest context, every society, every culture has a certain ethical or a faith, if you want to use the word faith, that may governs people's outlook, worldview. I'm just thinking of one example, life after death. Some people believe, some people don't. How does that then have organizes people's ideas about how they live their life if they have a belief that their soul exists after the body dies? And that will have a profound impact upon how people regulate, think and work and live their lives, for example.
And you've been using faith-based therapy with survivors and witnesses of the Grenfell disaster. Can you tell us more about that work?
I have a faith in spirituality, so that resonated and connected for me when I attended to the disaster. It came from a response of spirituality, where I wanted to offer and contribute to the society an opportunity to do something beyond just my, within this professional domain, if you like, which felt for me very ethical and personal response, that I have responsibility to try and be available. So I think that's what brought me to that context, was my response. I remember it was Ramadan. As a Muslim, I fast during the month of Ramadan, a spiritual detoxification and many other kind of ways of looking at it. And for me, when I entered into that work, I began to think about people's spiritual belief when they lose somebody in their loved one. How do you cope with disaster that's unexpected, unprecedented? How do people make meaning out of that? I think 95% of the families were of Islamic heritage or faith-based heritage. And in fact, the others were also faith-based, even if they're not Muslim, they're Christians, or were really faith-based sort of way. They brought that in a lot about how the church and the mosque and the community groups use their faith to cope with this disaster. And I think often when things like that happen, whether it's tsunami or hurricane or war, I guess it really deeply digs people's psyche and asks questions like, what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? What am I here to do then if this happens right here in the middle of London? And
women, I mean, we're doing this interview for International Women's Day. Have there been particular challenges that women at Grenfell have faced that you've encountered?
I mean, I used to run a women's coffee morning there as a result of acknowledging that women cope and come together in a women-only kind of space where they may feel more able to share their stories. So I think acknowledgement of that cultural sensitivity was important to be mindful of. And I think being a woman of faith, perhaps bringing that in and sometimes not feeling comfortable with other men there to talk about their experience was important. Also, if women are wearing what we call the hijab, covering head, and they want to take it off, it's really important, then they can come to a women-only space and just relax, and they don't have to think about what they're wearing, who's there. So, in that sense, I would try to create a space where women could come together and just feel, not necessarily at home, but feel more relaxed, that they can be a bit more open. So these kind of things sort of organised my sort of, in terms of programs that I was designing, being culturally sensitive to the, you know, and so it's very much tailor-made cohort to that individual group.
If somebody was thinking, like yourself, as a younger woman, of entering psychotherapy as a career, what would you say to them? What would you say to your younger self now?
For me, I can't really answer for other people what would they want to come to that. For me, it felt right, it felt a calling, it felt that this is what I want to do. I didn't know that when I was a young woman. I had no idea psychotherapy training, what that could look like. I did my degree at SOAS to do something more international development, where I did still wanted to work on a project level and helping people to think about, you know, healing and well-being and so on. But what inspired me was I became a mother. I have a daughter as well. She's now 19. And at that time, when I retrained into psychotherapy, so this is my second career, if you like, it was a shift. I was, you know, in my early 30s, and I was already a young mother. And without knowing quite, later on, I think I kind of put it, I thought, what kind of legacy would I like to leave my daughter and my progeny and the future generation? And so, you know, I'm hugely inspired, and I hope that, I think at one part is my daughter to carry on thinking about those ideas. You don't have to be a psychotherapist to have those ideas, but each of us do think about the purpose of life and the meaning, and make it good enough that we feel when we, you know, pass on to our future generation, that they can look back and see what we were trying to do. And we have an obligation environmentally in the world. You know, we talk about, you know, globalization and so on. How do we leave things behind for the whole? And Women's International Day, well, hey, you know, bring more women's voice and ideas, because I don't think that's been celebrated enough. People's ideas, and women's ideas in particular, and the way they live their lives and do living.